The Fiat G.50 Freccia, translated as Arrow in English, was an all-metal, single-seat, low-wing fighter used primarily by the Regia Aeronautica Italiana. As the Italian Air Force's first monoplane fighter aircraft, sporting an enclosed canopy and fully retractable landing gear, it served from 1938 through to the end of World War II, albeit somewhat outclassed in the latter years. With approximately 790 G.50s built, it was used extensively by the Italians in Northern Europe, North Africa, the Balkans, and the Italian mainland. Small numbers of the G.50 were flown by the Croatian Air Force, and 35 flew with distinction for the Finnish Air Force during both the Winter War and the continuation war against the Soviet Union. The road to the Fiat G.50 began in 1931. The Italian Ministry of Aviation, under the leadership of Italo Balbo, and later Giuseppe Gabrielli, was interested in adopting a new, all-metal monoplane fighter and ground attack aircraft for the Italian Air Force. This major expansion, known as Program R, would see Fiat capitalizing on the fascist government approach, forming a new aircraft technical bureau called Department 2, singularly devoted to designing and building brand new types of modern all-metal planes. The same year, Fiat founder and chairman Senator Angeli hired a young Italian engineer, Giuseppe Gabrielli. Gabrielli had gained some experience in aircraft design while working for Piaggio, including designing a seaplane that could be quickly dismantled and reassembled to be housed on board a submarine, and he built the prototype of the metal version of the S-55 seaplane. Gabrielli was also a prolific author in the field of aeronautics, with examples of his works including An Approximate Method for the Design of Aerial Propellers and experiences on unions with tubular rivets between thin-thickness dural sheets, dare I say, riveting material. Upon employment with Fiat, he immediately began working on several non-military aircraft projects, and it is here where we shall mention all his projects for Fiat were marked by the capital letter G, his initial. First was the G2, an all-metal three-engine plane, then the G8 biplane trainer, and later the G18, a twin-engine passenger plane. But with Program R ramping up, in January 1935, the Italian Air Force published a specification for a monoplane fighter attack aircraft to all domestic manufacturers. Specifically, the request was to use one air-cooled radial engine, be armed with 250 caliber heavy machine guns with at least 300 rounds of ammunition and one 20 or 37 millimeter gun, and include provisions for bombs for its ground attack role. Thus, in April of 1935, Gabrielli began working on a new low-wing, all-metal plane designated the G.50. His first draft was set to use the new Fiat A.74 RC38 14-cylinder radial piston engine, ostensibly a direct copy of the American Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp. With an output of 550 horsepower, the expected speed of the G.50 was around 285 miles per hour, fully loaded. However, in January 1936, the Ministry of Aviation changed its original request, dropping the ground attack capability, choosing instead to focus only on the fighter role. With the bomb load was deemed no longer necessary, and the main armament was reduced to only 250 caliber machine guns with 150 rounds each. And with the focus change now, the most important new requirement was that the new fighter should have the best possible flying performance. And it was here that the G.50 managed to edge out all comers. But more on that later. The G.50 project was now effectively reborn and moved to the Costruzioni Meccaniche Aeronautiche S.A. Works, abbreviated to CIMASA at Marina di Pisa, a Fiat subsidiary. Here, Gabrielli finished his last drawings in June 1936. The armament was reduced to 2 heavy machine guns without the bomb load, and now the plane would be powered by the new Fiat A.74 engine. The prototype, registered as MM334, made its first test flight on the 26th of February 1937, and it did not go well, Giovanni de Briganti, the C-Massa test pilot, reported strong vibrations during flight and the aircraft's tendency to spin. Following some modifications, the prototype was sent to the Regia Aeronautica Experimental Flight Center near Rome. There, the G.50 prototype was tested by Army pilots. They found the controls were still hard to work with at high speeds, and the craft maintained a lack of climbing ability. With Gabrielli returned to his drawing board to solve these problems, in October 1937, another prototype was produced, designated MM335. The second prototype made its first flight on the 20th of that month. This time, a series of flying tests were quite successful, until on the 11th of November, while flying the second prototype at high speed, the test pilot Briganti lost control and crashed to the ground. Unfortunately, he did not survive the crash. Now a combination of the accident, an inferior performance that did not meet expectations, and an overall better performance of the Mach-E C200 threatened to shut down the G.50 project altogether. But several factors were in Fiat's favor. During the flight tests held at Guidonia Airport, the G.50 had outturned the Mach-E. Given the specifications' emphasis on a highly maneuverable fighter, this was no small factor in continuing the G.50. Secondly, it would take too much time for Fiat to prepare tooling to produce the C200. In fact, the C-Massa works were already in process of producing a series of 45 G.50s, so it was deemed a waste of resources to abandon tooling equipment needed to produce the G.50 that were already under production. Lastly, it was clear that the G.50 could be brought into service much sooner than the C200. So the Air Ministry decided to go ahead with the current 45 G.50s, whose production was already underway, but insisted that the company overcome the shortcomings of the plane by the time of delivery. Of the 45 ordered, delivered in early 1939, the first 11 were used for more trials. These tests showed that the enclosed cockpit had several issues. The closed canopy was hard to open, not great for a pilot when bailing out in a terminal dive. Also, it was made of poor quality plexiglass, which was prone to cracking. It offered poor visibility, and on top of all that, sometimes exhaust fumes accumulated in the cockpit, forcing the pilots to fly with the canopy fully open. After some testing and modifications, it was decided a partially enclosed cockpit would be utilized instead. This solution was suboptimal and uncomfortable for pilots. Despite this, it was decided that all future planes would be built with an open cockpit only. With more modifications, the installation of a new startup system, a better undercarriage locking system, and the addition of an oxygen mask for piloting at high altitudes, the C-50 was finally fit for use and further production. The production version of the G-50 had a length of 26 feet 3 inches, stood at 10 feet 9 inches high, had a wingspan of 36 feet 1 inch, and a total wing area of 196 square feet. Powered by a Fiat A.74 RC 38 14-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine providing 870 horsepower. It had a maximum speed of 290 miles per hour at 16,000 feet, a range of 277 miles, a service ceiling of 35,100 feet, and could reach 16,000 feet in 6 minutes 3 seconds. It was armed with 250 caliber Breda-SAFAT machine guns in the nose, and the first versions could mount an optional pair of 303 caliber machine guns in the wings. A handful of variants emerged from the base G50. The G50 bis, with 421 produced, was Fiat's answer to the Air Force's demand for increased overall performance. It included extra fuel tanks, increasing capacity from 83.5 gallons to 108.3, redesigned rear fuselage and vertical tail surfaces, better glazing of the cockpit to protect the pilot from air turbulence, the addition of armor plates behind the pilot seat, and the tail wheel to be made retractable. And the original Arc 1 radio with its poor quality batteries was changed with the RB30. Several planes that were serving in North Africa were modified by adding sand filters and a bomb rack. The landing gear was also modified for easier landing on rough desert terrain. A ground attacker version, the G.50A, was conceived. With its central section of the wings extended to accommodate bomb racks and a further 250 caliber machine guns, the prototype serial number MM8595 was built and tested in October 1942. Unfortunately for Fiat, the concept failed and the project abandoned. The G.50 bis Tuffo dive bomber, G.50 Ter, G.52, G.53, and the G.50B naval observer all came and went, with perhaps one prototype built before cancellation. But the real contender for an important G.50 variant came in late 1939, when the Italian Ministry of Aviation began negotiations with the German Daimler-Benz company for a production license of the newest liquid-cooled DB601A engine. It had a much lower frontal area and had much better aerodynamics than the larger Italian Radial engines. The license was eventually obtained, and Alfa Romeo was put in charge of the production of this engine, but it was never built in any great numbers. Nevertheless, in early 1940, the Italian Ministry of Aviation asked Fiat to build a modified version of the G.50 using a Alfa Romeo 601. Two prototypes were to be built by Simasa, and these were marked as G.50V, the V standing for veloce, which means fast in Italian. The first prototype, serial number MM479, was built and tested in late August 1941. Immediately, the new design proved to have issues, such as an inefficient engine cooling system and the controls being difficult to operate. By the end of 1941, most of these problems were solved, and in December 1941, more extensive flight tests were carried out to determine the precise flight performance. The maximum speed achieved was 360 miles per hour, and an altitude of 16,400 feet was reached in just 5 minutes and 30 seconds. But due to the introduction of the new Fiat G.55 and the lack of DB601 engines, saw the G.50V project to join the litany of abandoned variations. The G.50 entered a war theatre in January 1939, when 12 new fighters were sent to Spain to assist the Franco government. But by this stage of the war, the opposing air force had been almost destroyed and air-to-air combat was rare. The only engagement occurred against a Soviet-built I-16, the opposing G.50 was damaged, and the pilot was forced to land. At the end of the war, the remaining 11 operational fighters were gifted to the Spanish fascist regime. The Finnish government, anticipating an attack by the Soviets, ordered 35 brand new G.50s in 1939, due to a convoluted supply line. They didn't arrive until late in the Winter War to replace the Gloucester Gladiators of the 26th Fighter Wing. Remarkably, Finnish pilots of the 26th, using G.50s, claimed to have shot down 11 Soviet planes before the end of the war, on the 13th of March 1940. The 26th would continue its excellent use of the aircraft in the continuation war. Oiva Tuominen, the most famous Finnish pilot, scored 15 air victories while flying the G.50. For his service, he was awarded the Mannerheim Cross, the highest Finnish military medal at the time. Indeed, by the war's end, the 26th Fighter Group had around 88 air victories with the loss of just 11 G.50s, and of those losses, only 2 were shot down by Soviet planes. By the time Italy entered the war on the Western Front, on the 10th of June 1940, it had 97 operational G.50s. They were mostly utilized covering SM-79 bombers during their attack on Corsica on the 15th to the 19th of June. Then the center of operations moved north to the French Alps on the 21st of June. It's worth noting the Italian pilots had difficulty transitioning from their biplanes to the G.50. For the most part, they were not provided adequate, if any, training, and struggled with control at high altitude and high speeds. Also, the open cockpit, while fine for typical Mediterranean climate, was freezing pilots, instruments, and causing fuel and battery issues in the colder weather of Northern Europe. The G.50 was proving highly susceptible to bad weather conditions, often cancelling their operations. Still, by October 1940, the 20 Gruppo commanded by Maggiore Bonzano formed to operate during the Battle of Britain, based in Maldegem, Belgium. Due to the G.50's lack of flight endurance, it was used mostly on surveillance missions along the coast of Europe, but the G.50 was no risk to Allied aircraft. Of the few encounters between the two, the Allies escaped with ease. With the Italian invasion of Greece in October 1940, 80 G.50s joined 64 Fiat CR-42 Falcos and 23 Fiat CR-32 Freccias, and soon overwhelmed the 45 outdated fighters of the Royal Hellenic Air Force. Thus, the G.50s were used as ground attack planes. But after the arrival of the British forces in November, the first air battles started. The G.50's main opponent was the Gloucester Gladiator, which had poorer flying performance in comparison. Later, however, more modern Hurricanes appeared. As the G.50 proved to be inferior to the Hurricane, they were gradually replaced with the more advanced Marquis C 200 fighters. During the North African campaign, the first G.50s were stationed near Tripoli by the end of 1940. The first units to operate in Africa were the 151st, 152nd, and 358th squadrons, with around 76 to 80 planes. Even before these units saw any action, there were great problems with the maintenance of these planes due to sand. In typical Italian logistic fashion, little thought was given to the problem. Thus, the demand for special sand filters was higher than availability. The G.50 saw heavy fighting in North Africa, where it was used in a standard fighter role for ground attack, defense missions, or for bomber escort. As the war progressed, the G.50 was adapted to be mostly used in a ground attack role by equipping them with 220 pounds of bomb load. By early 1942, despite reinforcements, G.50 losses were increasing. At the beginning of 1941, there were only 20 planes operational, but with reinforcements the number increased to 80 in October and then fell back to a low of 35 in December 1941. One might think this attrition meant the aircraft was hugely outclassed by its P-40 and Hurricane opponents. But in fact, most planes were lost, not in air combat, but instead during enemy ground and air attacks on airfields, as well as accidents. By the end of 1941, the only unit operating the G.50 was the 12th Group stationed at Tripoli. By 1942, most G.50 fighters were either lost or replaced with more modern Marquis C-200 and C-202s. The surviving G.50s were relocated to second-line airfields in Sardinia, Greece, and in the Aegean. By the time of the Axis defeat in Africa in 1943, only the 358th Squadron was still using the G.50. After the defeat in northern Africa, the Italian army was in disarray, and the rapid Allied landing in Sicily in July of 1943 worsened the situation. Many surviving G.50s were used to equip the 158th and 159th groups. These two groups suffered heavy losses attacking strong Allied positions in Sicily. Indeed, in a period of only a few days, the two groups ceased to exist. Such were their losses. By the 8th of September 1943, when Italy capitulated, there were only around 40 G.50 airplanes still in service, of which only 17 were operational. The Fiat G.50 was the first Italian all-metal fighter plane to enter operational service in significant numbers. In the early stages of the war, it proved to be an effective fighter, especially with the Finns, but as the war progressed, it became obvious that it was outdated in comparison with other modern fighters like the Hurricane, and it suffered from the general incompetence of the Italian command, often poorly supported or deployed without thought. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and leave a comment below. If you would like to see more, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification button.